All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Steve Keller. I'm the bilingual curriculum developer of online platforms and programs for the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. Now, typically, I do present from Peterborough, Ontario. However, due to the ongoing power outages caused by last weekend's massive storm, I am actually presenting in Whitby. Now, Whitby is a place where I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands of the people of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, covered under the Williams Treaties. Now, Whitby is situated on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas, a branch of the Greater Anishinaabe Nation, which includes Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations. Alex?
Yeah, I'm presenting from Winnipeg today, which is the traditional territory of the Cree, Oji, Cree nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation.
Wonderful. Wonderful. And for the next hour and a half, well, somewhere between about an hour to an hour and a half, we will be talking all about cannabis. Now, we have extended the duration of the national webinars as we have found several people have been staying on after the 60-minute mark to ask a great deal of questions, to engage a little bit more with some of the content, learn a little bit more about some of the research that we've looked into. So we have extended the presentation to be a 90-minute block. However, the workshop should wrap up probably around the 60 to 70-minute mark. If you do have any questions or comments, however, you are certainly welcome to stay on the call. Let's talk about what we'll be doing today. Certainly this afternoon, we will be discussing what cannabis actually is, as well as the methods of cannabis consumption amongst youth. In the past, cannabis discussions were based around just general conversations about cannabis, formerly known to some people as marijuana, weed, grass, pot, etc. But we understand that cannabis products are evolving, and they have evolved, and they will continue to evolve. So it's important that we understand the differences between, say, smoking a joint, using a dab, vaping, or having a drink of a cannabis beverage, or consuming a cannabis edible. With that in mind, each method carries its own risks, and with that in mind, we will also be examining both harm reduction and healthy living strategies, should you or someone else you know choose to use cannabis, or if perhaps you work with youth or have youth involved in your life that you would like to promote some of these harm reduction strategies too. And finally, we will also share resources available nationally as well as provincially, where you can learn more or find support if you or someone else you know does have questions about cannabis use. Let's talk a little bit about our program. Now, the Youth Cannabis Awareness Program is cannabis neutral. We are not here to pass judgment, nor are we here to say that cannabis is the greatest or worst thing that someone will do. We do promote the subject of cannabis from a balanced perspective, examining both the uses, the reasons for use, the potential medical applications of cannabis, as well as some of the risks of consumption, particularly for youth and adolescents under the age of 25. Now, the research that we will show you is evidence-based. We have taken information from national reporting surveys, Health Canada, reputed research facilities, peer-reviewed journals, medical documents, so that we can sort of examine things from as unbiased and neutral of a point of view as we possibly can. Now, the third thing that we talk about in our programs is harm reduction. Lex, how do you explain harm reduction when you're in the province of Manitoba?
Well, it's basically understanding that lots of things that we do have inherent risks involved with them. So cannabis is obviously one of those things. So we're going to talk about some ways that if you are going to use cannabis, or you're talking with someone who uses cannabis, that they can use it in a way that involves less potential for harm. So some examples of things that you might do that are harm reduction could be like wearing a helmet when you're riding a bike. Like, it's an inherently risky activity, involves the potential for harm. So that's a way of reducing that harm. Or if you are going out and you're going to have a few drinks, leaving your car at home so that you don't end up driving after having some alcohol. That's another example of harm reduction. So it's understanding that things that we do have risks, and there are things that we can do to mitigate those risks, even if we are going to choose to do some risky activities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Couldn't have said it any better. Now, we used to kind of give a general blanket definition of cannabis here, talking about all the different names and the history of the plant, and that we focus on medical and recreational use. But what we found is we want this to be a little bit more of a dialogue in this presentation. So my question for the audience, and you can answer this into the chat panel, is what do you know about cannabis? What have you talked about with cannabis? Is your degree of knowledge from research basis? Is it as an educator? Are you a member of the public that maybe doesn't have a great deal of understanding of cannabis? Feel free to answer. You can take a moment to type in your response. But what do you know about cannabis coming into today? Lex, when you first joined this program, what were some things that you knew about cannabis or maybe wanted to know more about?
Well, I knew before I joined the program, like I obviously knew that cannabis had harms, but I wanted to know a little bit more specifically about what those were, some of the evidence behind different ones, like how sure we were about different harms, that sort of thing. So you see, we are getting some responses in the chat now. Someone is saying it is a mood and mind altering substance. That's a great way to put it. Thanks, Carol.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, for me, but before I started this program, I knew many of my peers when I was younger that used cannabis. Some quit using during their teenage years, some used into their adulthood. I know some people that used that wouldn't really say they experienced any harms. I know others that used cannabis who did report that they saw harms. I had a friend of mine that wound up being diagnosed with cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome just a couple of years ago. So I've seen sort of both ends of the spectrum, but obviously as someone in this program, I still have a lot more to learn. I see we have a prevention substance use life skills class teacher here looking at talking about cannabis as well. I see someone else talking about working in the public health sector as well as promoting harm reduction. And I like that conversation about harm reduction. A lot of people believe that the Just Say No or the abstinence programs are entirely different from harm reduction. In a way, abstinence itself is a method of harm reduction. And in theory, it's the most effective in theory. But we do also know there's a significant percentage of the population that may choose to use cannabis or engage in other risky topics. So abstinence only doesn't work for everyone, right? But we do also understand certain harm reduction strategies, such as designating sober drivers or avoiding or limiting use prior to age 25. What are some of the other comments we're seeing there, Lex?
I see someone is saying that there are benefits, but also risks. They're talking a bit about the medicinal side there. And specifically cannabis-induced psychosis in the area they work in. That's a very interesting point. Thank you. Another person bringing up that there's not enough evidence in many areas of cannabis research. So it's important to increase public awareness about the health effects and potential risks of cannabis use. So I'm going to agree with that point about not enough evidence. I think we really need to increase our funding for these sort of research. Considering how many people use cannabis, like it's a very substantial portion of the Canadian population. I think we need to devote more time to understanding what the effects are, or more resources. So great point. Thank you, Brooke.
I would completely agree. And I would also speak to sort of the importance of brokering that knowledge too. Every day, it seems our staff shares new research that we find, but unless you're really looking for it specifically, it's difficult to track down. So a little bit more of that sort of brokering ability to be able to share the research that we find, like what we're going to do today here, hopefully, is a great way for us to make sure that this message and this research that's being done by programs like the SUAP funded programs through Health Canada can actually reach the population. And so I would certainly agree that there isn't enough evidence, but furthermore, a lot of it doesn't make it where it needs to. Okay, so we will move on to the next slide. Let's talk about some of the things that we do know. First and foremost, Lex, what is in cannabis? What are kind of the common cannabinoids that we find ourselves talking about?
Well, there are like hundreds of different cannabinoids, but the two that we focus on the most are THC or tetrahydrocannabinol and CBD or cannabidiol. So THC is the one you'll probably hear the most about because it is the one that is psychoactive and intoxicating. It is generally the most prominent cannabinoid in cannabis. And then there's also CBD, which is also present to some degree in all cannabis, sometimes at very, very low levels. But it is not intoxicating and generally used more for medical purposes. So often when you hear about medical cannabis, they're referring to varieties or strains or substances that have more CBD and generally less THC. That's not always true, but in general, it's a good shorthand to follow.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Now, one of the other things that we find ourselves talking about in cannabis, especially with young adults these days, tends to be things like terpenes, right? People talk about different products. They understand that they may actually taste different. They may smell different. And a lot of this is based on what we see around terpenes, right? Now, there is some research that does suggest that terpenes may actually alter the effects of CBD and THC. In fact, if you see a lot of research presented from the industrial side or the commercial side of cannabis, you'll see a lot of discussion about how terpenes may have a significant impact on CBD or THC. But again, as someone did mention earlier, the research and the evidence is still being cultivated, still developing. So the true degree of how much or how little terpenes have an effect is still being researched. We also know terpenes are found in all sorts of other products, right? So if you look at a terpene like myrcene, People think of terpenes and they often think of cannabis, but we find terpenes in hops. We find them in mangoes. We find limonene, which I find is great because it sounds like lime or lemon, in a great deal of citrus products, limes, lemons, oranges, especially the rinds, as well as ginger. Then you've got caryophyllene that's found in all sorts of different herbs. So this idea that many of the chemicals that we talk about in cannabis, the cannabinoids in particular, are specific to the plant, there are all sorts of different products that we research in cannabis that you can find in many common foods, and terpenes be an example of that. What age group reports the highest prevalence of cannabis users in Canada? Now, we changed this question around a little bit because we found it was a little misleading. Would you say it is teens ages 15 to 19, young adults 20 to 24, adults 25 to 64, or seniors age 65 and above? You can enter your response here into the chat. What do we think?
Looks like a lot of 20 to 24s.
Yeah. Yeah, see, when we used to do this presentation initially, we had it set up sort of as 15 to 24 and 25 to 44. And there was a lot of a divide there because there was this understanding that teens and adults over 25, their numbers might not be extremely significantly different. But what we did find, there is a difference, we'll show it on the next slide, but where you see a significantly higher prevalence of reporting of cannabis consumption is with the college age demographic, your 20 to 24-year-olds. Now, this is significant to note because we know that the human brain undergoes most of its development up to the age of 25. And often when we talk about the risks of youth or adolescent cannabis consumption, some youth may misinterpret that because they're of legal age to consume, here in Canada being anywhere from 18 in Alberta, 19 in other provinces and territories, or 21 in Quebec, they may falsely believe or misinterpret the legal age as being sort of the safe point in life when they can consume. But again, as we know, the brain is still developing till the age of 25, there are still risks to be considered for the young adult population. Now, if we were to actually take a look at these demographics and we look at cannabis consumption by age, we actually have a copy of the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol, and Drug Survey here from 2015 and 2017. Then when the survey separated to look at alcohol and drugs in one survey known as the CADS, we have the 2019 data. Now you'll notice a great deal of research and national reporting surveys have had a hard time collecting data during the COVID pandemic. In fact, next month when we unveil our new landscape presentation, we'll be able to share some of the data. But what we do know, regardless of the survey, and you'll find this in almost every national survey you look at, more 20 to 24-year-olds report past year cannabis use than any other demographic. And the prevalence use in young adults, and adults as well, has been increasing since 2015. There has been a misconception that youth cannabis consumption, underage cannabis consumption, perhaps increased after legalization. But the national reporting data that we've shown has really only shown a slight bump, not one that was like a 5 or an 8 or a 10% increase, but maybe a 1%, maybe a 1.4 in some surveys. There wasn't really this dire increase of cannabis consumption amongst underage youth, but there has been one amongst young adults in particular, and adults over age 25. Lex, and I know we can put this to the audience as well, but why might young people choose to use cannabis? We could talk about risks all day, right? But why might young people choose to use anyways?
Well, I think there's sort of two strains of this. One that I hear often when I'm in classrooms with youth talking about this is because their friends are doing it, because in the group that they're in, it's something that people do. They want to feel part of that group. So it's something that they do as well. You also hear a lot of stuff about dealing with struggles at home, dealing with anxiety, dealing with stress, that sort of thing. But I think it's important to also remember that people use cannabis because they enjoy it, for the effect, like Carol is saying, that it is a pleasurable experience for some people. I think it's important for us to remember that when we are talking about cannabis, is that it's not all people that are using it to escape things. Some people it's just because it's what people in their group are doing. Some people it's just something that they enjoy. They might not have an accurate view of what the risks are. They might, doesn't always track exactly. So those are some reasons that I hear when I'm talking to youth. What does the audience think? What do you guys think are some other reasons that people might choose to use cannabis?
Yeah, and just like Carol did, feel free to enter your responses into the chat on why you think young people may choose to use. I know you touched on some of them being the idea of fun or curiosity or relieving stress. What else do we have? I see someone saying experimentation. Absolutely. There's that idea of curiosity. The idea that it might feel good, talking about some people just like the feeling of being impaired, or maybe if they're using CBD leaning products, they may find that maybe they feel a little less pain, right? Physical pain. Low perception of harm. Parents do it, so perhaps they see someone they look up to using. Managing anxiety. Do we see any others there, Lex?
Yeah, see, someone to help with sleep. That is one I hear among my peers a lot, actually, that people struggling with sleep use cannabis to help with that. That's a great point. Thanks, Brooke. To escape uncomfortable situations and to help them fit in. Yeah, all stuff that I hear when I'm talking to youth as well, and stuff that I think that we will see came from these surveys that we're going to look at in a second here.
Absolutely. If you were to look at the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Sensible Cannabis Education Toolkit, a resource which we will connect you to at the end of the presentation, many of the reasons that you've all cited are exactly what we would see. Those ideas of fun, of pleasure, of relieving pain, relieving stress, social conventions. The list is extensive, and we could just spend an entire day on this slide alone. But understanding intentionality in some ways is more important than understanding simply does someone use or does someone not use, because that intentionality may shape or affect the potential for them to experience any risks or possible harms. For example, if someone is using cannabis as a coping mechanism, as a primary coping mechanism, and losing sight of the other things that they enjoy doing, they may over time begin to experience more and more problems related to cannabis use, perhaps even related to dependency. However, if someone maybe uses once in a while when they're stressed out, but has a balanced sort of toolkit of various coping strategies, if they use with friends, if they know to take breaks, again, they might use once in a while to deal with stress. But that's a different conversation than someone who's using every time they feel stressed. And so it becomes really important to have that conversation if you know someone's using, or if someone mentions to you that they're using, what factors maybe help determine that decision for them. Tip my hand here on this a moment ago, but what is the average legal age to buy, consume, or possess cannabis in Canada? Is it 16, 18, 19, or 21 years of age? And I'm really surprised I find how often people get this one wrong. (19, 21, 19, 19, 19). Well, survey says the answer on average is around age 19. Now, there are two provinces that do have an exception. Lex, what are the two provinces where the age is not 19 in Canada?
Well, if you're in Alberta, the age there is 18. And if you are in Quebec, the average age or the age is 21.
Absolutely. And one thing to note about Quebec is when legalization first took place, Quebec initially set their legal age to be 18. However, citing increasing research into the development of adolescent brains and the risks of cannabis use for a younger user, Quebec did increase their legal age in 2020 from the age of 18 to the age of 21. So we did see a bit of a shift there in one of the provinces. Now, if we're going to talk about legalization and we're going to talk about legal age and we're going to talk about what's gone on since legalization, one thing we do like to point out is some of the limitations of the Cannabis Act. We know cannabis was made legal in October 2018 for recreational use, and medicinally it was made legal in the early 2000s. But we do know there are still some provisions that Canadians need to understand, and some of them aren't always totally aware of these. Let's point some of them out. First is the idea that adults may not possess over 30 grams of dried leaf cannabis or its equivalent, and they may not publicly possess any illicit or illegal cannabis. Now, underage individuals found in possession under 5 grams may be fined or have their parents notified. Now, if they're found in possession of over 5 grams and are underage, they may face potential criminal conviction. So this is one thing that has changed since legalization. Is prior to legalization, any possession could have resulted in sort of court time or potential diversion programs or community service. But one of the changes in legalization was that youth found in possession of a very small amount may simply face a summary fine instead of a full criminal conviction. Under the Cannabis Act, there's actually a limit to how many plants can be grown per household. Now, Quebec, Manitoba, and Nunavut do not allow any cannabis plants to be grown within a household. Most other provinces allow growing up to 4 plants. We also know that adults cannot buy, sell, or give cannabis to a minor, and they also cannot use a minor to commit a cannabis-related offense. Lex, what does that mean, using a minor to commit a cannabis-related offense?
Well, that could be a lot of different things. It could be giving cannabis to a youth to like take over the border to the United States or something. It could be giving cannabis to a youth to sell for them, to carry for them. Just generally giving cannabis to a youth and having that youth commit a crime on their behalf.
Absolutely. And the penalty for this is quite significant. An of-age Canadian found to be using a minor to commit a cannabis-related offense can actually face up to 14 years in federal prison. It is a significant offense under the Cannabis Act. Now, one thing that we do always like to point out to of-age adults is that they cannot drive while impaired by cannabis, nor can they actually be impaired as the supervisor to a learning driver. The point of the supervisor with a learning driver, so here in Ontario would be a youth with a G1, is that that supervisor needs to be prepared to step in and drive should that youth experience any issue while driving. Now, if that adult or that full licensed driver is impaired, they cannot legally do that. So they cannot be impaired even if their G1 driver is to be their designated driver. That can't really happen. A moment ago, we asked why youth might choose to avoid using cannabis. Now, I do have the first reason up here as being the fear of consequences. Now, this may particularly be legal ramifications, getting in trouble with parents, trouble with school, but why else might that be, Lex? Why else might youth choose not to use cannabis?
Well, a lot of what I hear, again, when I'm talking with youth about this is stuff like they're worried about the harms that they might face from it. They're worried about their peers judging them for using it. It just doesn't fit with like their conception of who they are. Like they don't think of themselves as someone who uses cannabis because they think of themselves as an athlete or a scholar or whatever conception they have of themselves. Cannabis to them doesn't fit in with that. Is a lot of what I hear sort of boiled down to the simple points. But again, we'd like to hear what the audience has to think. If you guys would post your answers in the chat for this, that'd be awesome.
It's a fair question, right? If we're going to ask why youth would use, it's probably a good idea to ask some youth why they don't. Health reasons, diagnosed mental health problem. What else are we seeing there, Lex?
I don't like the smell. That is one I hear a lot too. People complaining about the smell. It can smell pretty bad.
Yeah, it's not always the most pleasant smell. I see commitments to sports, commitment to school, memory problems. So we do have quite the list here. Now, this has come from both the CSSDP as well as the Canadian Centre on Substance Use and Addictions. So some of the things that we saw here were fear of consequence, negative effects on the body and mind, stigmatization, and opinions about substance use. But one thing really to note is the importance of empathy. When you look at the factors behind why someone would decide to use and the factors why someone would decide not to use, in many situations, those factors can be quite similar, maybe even the same. Earlier, we talked about the idea that some people may use cannabis to fit in. They don't want to be judged for not using, right? They want to be accepted socially by their peers. Some other youth may say the total opposite. They may say that they don't use cannabis because they don't want to be judged for using. They want to try to fit in with their peers. Adolescence is a stressful time in life, and trying to sort of identify your peer groups and the people around you can be difficult. It can be kind of like navigating a minefield. So these factors can sort of work both ways. Health concerns is one that we see. Some youth cite using cannabis because they find that it helps them relax when they're stressed out. However, other people that maybe are experiencing social anxiety disorders or certain psychological disorders may not use cannabis because they might find that the compounds and chemicals in cannabis may worsen those feelings. I like the point here about more education surrounding the effects of substances like cannabis in recent years. That is certainly a factor we see is youth are a lot more savvy than they used to be. They're still learning, but they certainly are a lot more savvy when it comes to understanding these things. And I think wanting to understand them. Would that be fair to say, Lex?
Yeah, definitely.
All right. How's cannabis consumed? Now, again, at the beginning of this presentation, I talked about the idea that in the past, when we talked about cannabis, most people were thinking of consumption as being joints, maybe bongs, maybe you knew someone that cooked some brownies. But cannabis consumption has evolved in the last 10 to 15, 20 years. Yes, we know smoking dried leaf product is still quite present, but we also know that people can vape e-liquids or dried leaf products. We also know, in addition to vaping, we have dabbing, concentrated extracts. Now, every time I do a presentation, I always get someone that asks, what is dabbing? Lex, how would you explain a dab to the audience?
Well, it's a really concentrated form of cannabis where the chemicals that we talked about earlier, that THC and CBD, are extracted from the plant of cannabis into some other substance, sometimes called shatter or wax or other things. And that is heated up to the point where those chemicals are emitted as fumes that the person can inhale through something called a dab rig. So essentially what's important to understand is that it's just a very, very concentrated form of consuming cannabis. And it has some of the highest levels of THC of any of the forms that we're going to talk about here. And because of that really high level of THC, it comes with greater risk of cannabis dependency and greater risk of future mental health problems and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, after dabs, we do have eating products prepared with cannabis, and we've seen all sorts of edibles in research at conferences and discussion. We've seen cookies, we've seen gummies, we've seen cake pops, we've seen pies. I saw a chicken pot pie at a conference that was baked in with cannabis. People have found all kinds of ways to cook and prep edibles with cannabis products. We see drinking cannabis-infused beverages, teas, sparkling sodas. I've seen out west, I believe I saw some provinces talking about cannabis-infused drink crystals as a possibility. We see application to the skin. These can be topical creams, bath bombs. And we also see applying under the tongue, right? So those sublingual syringes, having like a small dropper, being able to drop it either directly onto the tongue, or these products may even be dropped onto food. So dropping small, low potency oils. And in many situations, these oils do tend to be quite low in THC. Now, there is one method that does stand out as actually being most popular among young adults in Canada. We know the young adult demographic reports a higher rate than any other age group. But which of the four methods you see on the screen do you believe is the most popular amongst young adults? Is it cannabis edibles? Is it dabbing extracts? Is it smoking pipes, joints, or bongs? Or is it vaping? What does our audience think here? A lot of votes for vaping. What else are we seeing?
Yeah, a lot of vaping. See, there are a couple for smoking or for eating, some for smoking. But yeah, a lot of vaping. Oh, one for dabbing.
For dabbing. Yeah. Okay. I'll give you guys a few more moments to think about it. I'll post up the answer here in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Poll is now closing. The answer here does surprise some people. It does remain smoking dried leaf product. Now, if we look at reported methods of cannabis consumption as recently as 2021, when we look at young adults, according to the Canadian Cannabis Survey, which is a national survey, including representation from all provinces and territories, looking at patterns and behaviors and habits when it comes to cannabis consumption, we find that dried leaf cannabis is the most commonly reported. What does surprise some people, though, is that more people report using edibles than they do report vaporizing, using either a vaporizer or a vape pen or cigarette. In fact, if you were to combine the 11.4% of people that report vaping with a stationary vaporizer with the 38.6% of people that report using a vape pen or a cigarette, you still wouldn't come close to the 61.5% of the population that reports using edibles. Vaping gets a lot of attention, and for very good reason. There's a lot of research emerging on vaping and a lot we still don't know. And we will talk about these different methods of consumption because they all carry different risks. But one thing that does catch people by surprise is that dried leaf product still dominates the market. And even more surprising is that more Canadians report using edibles than they do report vaping. And this is the same with all age groups. You'll see edibles tend to be the second most commonly reported, followed by vaping. Now, the beverage market amongst young adults has increased quite a bit in the past 12 to 24 months, sorry. When we saw this survey reported a year earlier, there was about half as many people reporting that they used cannabis-infused beverages. So we do know that the beverage market is increasing, and we will have more to say about that a little bit later on. Now, if we're looking at different products, I pointed out all these different methods of consumption, right? And we looked at which one might be the most sort of popular. But we also want to take a look at the potency of these products. Now, if we look at dried leaf product, currently dried leaf product on the market contains up to about a maximum of about 30% THC. Now, regulated product, the average THC content tends to be around 15 to 18%, but illicit cannabis or street cannabis, the average potency from product C's tends to come in around 25 to 28%. So we see the maximum for dried leaf can be up to 30%. Edibles, you can't really say there's an exact percentage of what you're going to see in the market. It really depends on how much THC is mixed in with the edible that's being made, what's the ratio of cannabis to edible, and what's the potency of the cannabis being put in. So there's not one set number there. Vapes can be quite significant. Now, you can vaporize dried leaf cannabis using a vape pen or a stationary unit. So in that case, you would only be getting up to 30% THC. But we know that e-liquids and concentrates that are vaporized through these pens can be up to 90% THC, in some cases even a little bit higher. These are much more potent, much more significant methods of consuming a product that can have quite the psychoactive effect on the mind. Cannabis oil for oral use usually is about up to 3% when we're looking at the oils themselves. But if you were to take a look at soft gel capsules, this really depends again on how much product is being mixed in and what's the potency of the product being added. So sublingual oils tend to be quite low potency, but the soft gel capsules themselves may not be quite so low in some cases. Beverages, similar to edibles, depends on how much is being mixed in. Dabs, similar to vaporizers, we have seen dabs increasing in potency quite significantly. In 2018, when cannabis was legalized recreationally, the Health Canada website found that concentrates, physical concentrates, could be up to 60% THC. Now, if you were to go onto a provincially regulated website and actually take a look at some of the physical extracts that we see for dabs, we've seen potencies well above 60%. We've seen them in the 70s and in some cases even in the low 80s. So we know that potency of concentrates is not only significantly higher than dried leaf, but the market is seeing an increase in potency. Vaporizing with a vaporizer, similar to the vape pen and cigarette, it depends on if you're using the dried leaf or concentrate. And finally, topicals, it really depends on how much of the product is being mixed into the cream or lotion being added to the skin. True or false? In 2021, approximately 1 in 5 adults, aged 20 to 24, did not actually know the levels of THC and CBD in the products that they consumed. Does that sound true? Does it sound like more than that? Could it be less than that?
Seeing a lot of truths here.
A lot of truths here, right? A couple votes for false. The answer here is this is actually indeed true. Lex, why is it so important that people know the potencies in the products they're consuming?
Well, the first point is that products that have more THC generally have the potential for greater harm, and they're also more intoxicating, which is also something that you need to take into account if you're someone that uses cannabis, that you want to know what sort of effect the product that you're using is going to have on you, so you don't end up in a situation where you are over intoxicated, where you get cannabis poisoning or green out as it's commonly referred to. So there's lots of reasons why it's important, but yeah, I think this is something that has been made a lot easier post legalization, because any regulated product is going to have that number right on the packaging. So if the person is buying it from a regulated store, it's a lot easier now to find out than pre-legalization.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I always say this is sort of the linchpin of this presentation. It's the point whereby we see sort of the most really important kind of thrust of this discussion. Why is it that cannabis affects people differently? Why does THC have such a profound and different effect on one person to the next? Now, before we post up the list of reasons that we've seen through various research, what does our audience think here? Why does THC affect everyone so differently? Why is it that two people could go to a party together, smoke a bong, one has a great time, eats an extra slice of pizza, has some laughs, the other one's having panic attacks all night? Why is that? I see one of our audience members talks about what's being consumed in the day, the physiology of the brain itself. Absolutely. What else do we see here?
Yeah, so I'm mentioning the environment the person's in, that can also have a big effect on how the THC interacts with them at that point, whether they feel safe or whether they feel in danger wherever they are. Their metabolism, yeah, that's another big one too.
Absolutely. I used to have a peer in this program. He used to talk about the idea of a person's set and their setting being different. So their mindset, right? If they're in a different mood, they may find that the product has different effects on them, but also their setting itself. If they're in a situation or a place whereby they're already feeling stressed or uncomfortable, they may feel more stressed or uncomfortable if they use. If they're in a space where they already feel safe, they may feel less stressed when they use. So for some people, that can be the total opposite. It can really be different person to person. But I do see quite the list of reasons here. Let's pull up some of the human factors. These can include previous experience and frequency of use. Is this the person's first time using, or have they been using for a few years? Have they been using every day, or are they using once or twice a month? Could be their body composition. How large is the person? What's their height? What's their weight? What's their age? Because we know the human brain is still developing until the age of 25. An adult that uses cannabis in, say, their late 30s or 40s may report a different response in terms of their cognitive processes than someone 14 years old using cannabis. How much the THC the body can actually absorb can be different. The current mood and state of mind, their medical history. What about some of the plant-based reasons, Lex? What are some of those factors?
Well, we know when you mix cannabis with other substances like alcohol or tobacco, it changes the effect that it has on you, as well as any other drug that the person might be consuming. And especially with alcohol, the risk there is that it sort of combines the effects of both of them and multiplies the effect. And the person is much more likely to end up over intoxicated and in a situation where they're putting themselves in an unsafe situation. How much they consume obviously has an effect on the experience the person's going to have. The way they consume, as we talked about, different methods of consumption have vastly different levels of THC. And as the last point here, the levels of THC and CBD is going to have a big effect on the person's experience. Like you hear a lot of older people talk about how cannabis didn't used to be as strong as it is now. And the data bears that out, that cannabis has been increasing in potency for a very long period of time. So lower THC cannabis is going to make you feel very different than higher THC cannabis.
Absolutely. And I'm really glad you pointed out that increase in consumption. If we were to look back at the 1980s, the average THC level of cannabis products in the 1980s was only around 2%. THC potency nowadays in dried leaf alone can be up to 30%. That's 15 times higher than it used to be. So this significant increase could contribute to a very different response. Now, if we were to look at different methods of consumption, we understand that there are different things to be considered. And the first thing we want to think about is, when will the person actually feel the product's effects? When will the effects peak? And finally, how long will those effects last? So Lex, for dried leaf cannabis, how long does it take for a person to feel the effects of dried leaf cannabis?
Well, they're gonna start to feel the effects pretty much immediately, within seconds, and then they're gonna start to feel the majority of the effects within minutes, and then within about half an hour, they're going to feel the height of the effects, and it's going to last for 6-ish hours. But if a very high dose is consumed, it can last much longer than that, up to 24 hours.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So some of the things you may see happen there could include things like damage to the lungs. We know that smoking dried leaf product is considered the most physically harmful at this point method of cannabis consumption. We take a look at the carcinogens and chemicals found in cannabis smoke. There are many chemicals found in cannabis smoke that are also found in tobacco smoke, not to the same frequency as what we may find in tobacco smoke, but we do find heavy metals, we find hydrogen cyanide, we find ammonia, we find tar in cannabis smoke. And one thing to consider about individuals that smoke cannabis on a heavy basis or a frequent basis, they tend to take deeper breaths when they're inhaling cannabis, and they tend to hold their breath for longer. Because there's this misconception that people believe if you hold your breath while smoking cannabis, it gets you more high. This isn't really true. What the brain is actually experiencing there is simply a lack of oxygen. And so that heightened feeling of awareness or of anxiety or of almost a frenetic energy is not due to cannabis causing a greater degree of impairment. It's the person holding their breath and their brain sounding the alarm that they're oxygen deprived. But holding your breath, one thing that it does do is it allows the tar in the cannabis smoke more time to settle at the bottom of the lungs. And some of the research that I've actually seen from cannabis users who use regularly over the course of many years is they may actually report higher degrees of tar than someone who smokes tobacco chronically. We also see increased exposure to toxic fumes, especially in like cheap pipes or bongs, if they're made of plastic or plastic lined inside, as these can melt. We see the risk of spreading bacteria and viruses if the individual is sharing joints, pipes, bongs, etc., with people around them. Common practice in smoking dried leaf cannabis is to have a session, right? You get together with people, they smoke together, you get 8 or 9 people putting their mouth on the same product. We are in the middle of an ongoing pandemic, not to mention there's always cold and flu season to consider, so there is the risk of spreading bacteria. It's also worth noting that some bowls may be laced, either intentionally or accidentally, with other substances. And particularly illicit cannabis, we may find being laced with other substances. Legal market products have to be regulated in terms of what they can and cannot have and what they do and do not have in their packaging. So a street market product or illicit product may be more likely to be laced. Lex, what are some strategies we could perhaps propose to reduce the harms of dried leaf cannabis?
Well, if you are going to use cannabis, it's better to limit how frequently you use it, especially limit how frequently you use inhaled products. As Steve was mentioning there before, the more often you're smoking, the more smoke that's entering your lungs, the greater potential for tar buildup there is there. If you are using like a device, like a bong or a pipe, make sure that it's cleaned regularly. Make sure that you're not using a plastic one that's going to release toxic chemicals when it's heated. Using something like steel or glass or brass is better. Waiting between puffs or inhalations is important because, as we were saying before, the full effects don't hit you right away. So you want to make sure that if you are using, you're not consuming too much too fast and giving yourself cannabis poisoning or greening out or whatever. And consider how many people and who you're sharing a joint or a bong with, especially as Steve mentioned, we are in the middle of a pandemic. So sharing these things can increase the risk from other diseases getting involved there.
Absolutely. Now, if we're going to look at dried leaf cannabis, the next thing we should probably take a look at is edibles, right? We said they're the second most commonly reported method of consumption for young adults, but also for the population in general. I have a question for the audience: is how long does it take to feel the effects of an edible? You can take a moment to think about this. How long do you think it takes for a person to actually start feeling the effects of eating a cannabis product? Differs for every person. It does. It can differ person to person. There is an average range that we see. It's wide, but there is an average range, and we'll talk about that in a moment. I see 20 minutes. What else do we see there, Lex? What are some of the answers we're seeing?
30 minutes to 2 hours. Someone said 5 minutes. So pretty wide range answers for this one.
Yeah, absolutely. This one can actually catch people by surprise. In fact, research from Dr. Hammond at the Dr. Andrew Hammond at the University of Waterloo, I think it was in 2020, was actually looking at the health labeling and the health warnings that we see on cannabis products. And one of the things that they actually found was that what most people reported that they didn't know before seeing that was how long it takes for an edible to take effect. And this can be surprising for some people. Cannabis edibles can actually take effect between about 90 minutes to 2 hours, although in some situations it can actually take up to 4 hours before a person feels anything. Now, the effects are going to start to peak after that 4-hour mark. Now, the effects themselves can actually last for a period of up to an entire 24 hours. Now, for some people, like I said, this can be a little bit surprising, especially if, say, they've smoked a joint before or vaped cannabis before and they feel something within a couple minutes, but they have an edible. 10 minutes go by, 20 minutes go by, and they don't feel anything. Lex, why do edibles take effect slower than inhaled products?
Well, the method that they enter your bloodstream is actually different than with inhaled products. So your body actually partially digests the THC and turns it into a slightly different chemical, and then that chemical is absorbed into your bloodstream. So it's a different process. It's not entering through your lungs and into your bloodstream that way. It's going through a partial digestion process before it's entering your bloodstream and you're feeling the intoxicating effects there.
Absolutely. Now, Lex, a little while ago you talked about greening out, and you mentioned the idea of cannabis poisoning. About a year ago, Sick Kids issued a report that found that children under 12 who were hospitalized as a result of using cannabis that made trips to, say, the ER were actually far more likely to do so if they had taken an edible than if they had tried smoking a joint or vaping a product. We talk about the idea that edibles can take longer to take effect. If a person waits 20 minutes and they don't feel something, and they don't know that it's going to take a while, what might they choose to do if they don't feel something after 20 minutes?
Well, they might decide to take more.
They might decide to take more. Another 20 minutes go by, they don't feel anything. Maybe they decide to take more. 2 hours hit, maybe instead of having one edible, they've had 3 or 4 or 5. Now they're starting to feel something. They may feel like, oh, well, it's a good thing I took 4 or 5 because now I'm feeling something. But that impairment is going to continue to increase. And as their peers around them have smoked a joint or vaped, and after the 6-hour mark maybe down or coming quite far down on their impairment, the person that's taking an edible is still getting increasingly impaired or still remaining impaired for 6 hours longer, 12 hours longer. One of the risks of cannabis edibles is the increased risk of cannabis poisoning. And a lot of this is based on the idea that people don't really recognize how long it can take for an edible to take effect. There's also unpredictable THC results to consider. If the person has made the product at home, it's not well mixed. Perhaps they make a batch of brownies with, we'll say 50 milligrams of THC in the cannabis. Now, perhaps they mix up this batter so that 40 milligrams of it is in half the batter and 10 milligrams is in the other half of the batter. A person that would eat a brownie from one side of that plate may have a very different effect than the person that ate from the other side. The other issue is with illicit market products. They tend to not be properly labeled. In many cases, they're overestimated in terms of how much THC is in them. But there are significant cases whereby the product may not label properly how much THC is in it and may say it actually has less than it actually does. Or, of course, with illicit products, you may not see a label at all. Consuming on an empty stomach may cause some effects of cannabis impairment to be a little more sharp or take effect a little more quickly. There's also the risk of accidental ingestion by young children and pets. Many cannabis edibles are sweets, they're cookies, they're brownies, they're cake. They're delicious. Those are things that are very tempting to, say, a 6-year-old child or a 2-year-old bloodhound like the dog that I have. They would eat that and find themselves in a very potentially risky situation. So, Lex, how do we reduce these risks?
Well, as we were mentioning before, it's important to wait between bites or pieces to make sure that you know what sort of effect it's going to have before deciding whether to consume more. Make sure you're not consuming it on an empty stomach. If you have food allergies, make sure you consider those. And that last point there, make sure that if you have edibles in your home, that they are stored somewhere safely, preferably somewhere high, preferably somewhere locked, so that kids and pets aren't going to accidentally get into them, because especially with illegal market ones, it can be very difficult to tell the difference between a regular snack and a cannabis edible.
Absolutely. Now, a few years ago, the CIHI reported that cannabis use was cited as the main substance used in what percentage of substance-related hospitalizations of youth ages 10 to 24 in Canada? Is it 14% or 1 in 7, 22%, about 1 in 5, 1 in 4, 35% or 63%? What do we see here? I see some votes for 35, I see 14, I see 22, I see 35. Now, this was a really interesting report because the report actually said that cannabis use was cited in 40% of substance-related hospitalizations. But if you dug a little bit deeper into the report, what they actually found was that it was the main substance reported, or the only substance reported, in 22% of cases, so about 1 in 5. Now, some of the reasons that an individual may be hospitalized due to cannabis consumption could include greening out or overconsumption. Could include accidents that took place while that person was impaired. Perhaps they slipped and fell. They got involved in a physical altercation while impaired, wound up getting injured. For other people, it was being hospitalized due to psychological related issues. These could include substance-induced psychotic episodes, increased or worsening symptomology of things like major depressive disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar or social anxiety. But there was a wide array of reasons that an individual may seek hospitalization and cite the use of cannabis as the reason or part of the reason that they were seeking hospitalization or seeking medical support. Now, when we look at dabbing, dabbing is an inhaled substance similar to smoking joints, pipes, bongs. So the effects take place, peak, and last at a fairly similar rate, right? So we know that dabbing, a person can feel effects within a few seconds to a couple minutes. Similar to smoking, the effects are going to peak after 10 to 30 minutes. And the effects can last for a period of up to 6 hours. Some people may report them even after 12 hours. In some cases, some people may report feeling some effects up to a full 24-hour window. Now, Lex, what might happen if a person were to choose to dab? What are some of the possible risks of those concentrates?
Well, as we mentioned before, dabbing has extremely high levels of THC, so it takes a very, very small amount of the substance that people dab with, whether that's wax or shad or whatever, to accidentally over intoxicate yourself, to green out, to ingest more THC than you would like. And because it is so concentrated and so fast acting, it is more likely to lead to cannabis use disorder than some of the other methods we discussed here. So this is something that's common across any addictive substance, the more fast acting version of that is the more addictive version of that. I read a study where they offered they did an aerosolized version of alcohol versus liquid alcohol, and they found the aerosolized version was more addictive. So it's something that's common across different substances, that faster acting versions are more likely to lead to a dependency. And then there's the possible impacts that high THC can have on your mental health and your brain development. And because they're heating these substances up, using sometimes homemade things like a piece of cutlery heated on the stove or a blowtorch or that sort of thing, then there's the possibility of burning yourself when you're preparing the dab as well.
The other thing about the burns, I remember reading as well that illicit dabs, some of the solvents that are used to prepare dabs include things like butane or alcohol. Now, if a dab isn't really separated properly, sometimes some of these incendiary fluids can actually remain inside of the dab itself. So if a person does light it, there is the potential risk, especially if they bought an illicit product, that it may, it's going to sound ridiculous, instead of burning, it may sort of catch fire, so to speak, which does increase the risk of the person actually being burned by the improper preparation of the dab itself. So ways that we reduce harms with dabbing is generally to consider the age or the experience level of the individual. New users or youth should really avoid the use of dabs, especially if they're coming from the illicit market. And we know that a dab the size of a grain of rice can be potent enough to cause significant impairment. So if a person does choose to use a dab instead of using the entire piece, to maybe shave off a smaller piece and start with that low amount and wait and see how they feel. Finally, if we're looking at the most common methods of consumption, we also have to point out vaping. We would be remiss if we were not to do so. So we want to make sure that we identify the things about vaping. We know the effects of vaping. Again, inhaled substance can be very quick. The effects will peak usually around the 10 to 30 minute mark, and similar to smoking and dabbing, the effects can last a period of 6 to 24 hours. Lex, what are some of the risks of vaping? What can happen if a person chooses to vape?
Well, a lot of the risks come from the high levels of THC that we talked about with dabbing, because vapes often will have the really high concentration as well. But specifically, some of the risks for vaping come from these substances that are sometimes mixed in with the vape fluids. And this is generally in vapes from the illicit market. So these will sometimes have things like vitamin E or flavoring substances, or things to make the smoke look or smell different, that these products, when vaped, can lead to some pretty nasty lung diseases. So generally, these things aren't present in legal market vapes. Those ones will still have the really high level of THC, which can pose its own risks, but they won't have these sort of extra dangerous chemicals. And generally, vaping, it's still pretty new. So we're still learning more about the potential risks from it. So it takes a long time for when a new product like this emerges to really understand the full risks that go along with it, because you just need a big sample size and a long period of time to really understand all these risks. So generally, yeah, those are the risks that go along with vaping.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, if you are someone who's choosing to vape, or if you know someone that's considering vaping, again, new users or youth are generally recommended to avoid vaping, particularly vaping concentrates and e-liquids, especially from the illicit market. There's a bit of a, not totally a myth, not totally a misconception, the idea that vaping is a harm reduction strategy for inhaling cannabis. While it is true that if you were to choose to vape a product, you would be less likely to inhale, in many cases, the carcinogens that you would be in smoking a joint or inhaling from a pipe, there is something certainly to be said about that, to reduce the physical risks. But as Lex referred to, many of those higher potency products that can be vaped may cause an increased risk of psychological related harms. So the idea of calling vaping simply harm reduction, there's a little bit more to it that needs to be understood. So if a person's considering vaping, they may want to consider vaping dried leaf product instead of e-liquids. And again, they should probably look at vaping at lower temperatures just to reduce the risk of burns and of burning off more of the product. Now, if we take a look at the labels on a legal market product, we talk about the importance of buying legal and the harm reduction strategy in buying legal. There is a difference to be understood about a legal product versus an illicit product. And there's usually about 6 different ways you can tell a product is legal. First thing, you're going to see the standardized cannabis symbol right on the logo, the product itself. Also, if you take a look at this package, you'll notice it's kind of bland. It's one flat color, no embossed typing, no beautiful, pretty pictures all over it. Legal market producers are not allowed to create products that look flashy or may look appealing to a young or underage person. So that can often be one way to tell. Second, you'll see the THC or CBD content clearly marked on the product itself. You'll see a health warning. Here we have do not drive or operate heavy equipment after using. You'll see the excise stamp to show there was a duty paid in the province. Here we have one from the province of BC. You have the barcode from the legally purchased product. And finally, you'll have the product weight in and of itself. So the product you see here would be a legal market product that we could see. Now, are young people still using hash? Now, hash is an example of a physical cannabis extract. So it's one that's been sifted or sort of dry filtered to remove the non-intoxicating parts of the plant. So you will still see hash as being an extract that people would choose to smoke. And it is more potent than, say, smoking dried leaf product because you've removed essentially the parts of the plant that are not intoxicating and are left with a more potent substance. So to answer your question, we do know that hash is still used by youth. Now, what's an illicit product look like? Here we got one from Six Spencery. Cute pictures, bright colors, flashy lettering, lava cake spelled all, strangely. This is an illicit product. There's no product information on here. There is no label. There's no health warning, no excise stamp, no barcode. There's 7 grams. What's that 7 grams of? Is that 7 grams of the product? Is that 7 grams of THC? Is that 7 grams of sugar? I got no idea what's in this package. This is an illicit market package. So if you're ever having a conversation with someone about packaging and how to tell a legal from an illegal market package, one way I've joked before about is one way you can tell is if the product looks really boring, it's probably a legal product. If it looks like something really flashy, chances are it's probably not. Fair to say, Lex?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's some gray area for some stuff in plastic baggies there as well. But I think that is a good rule of thumb, Steve.
Yeah. So some producers and some distributors do get creative with what they can and can't do. I will certainly say that. According to the Canadian Cannabis Survey, we know that about 1 in 6 Canadians aged 16 and up do report using cannabis and alcohol together. When those who use cannabis report mixing with alcohol, either often or always. Now, Lex, you pointed out some of the risks of this quite well. So I'm going to bring them up again, but just kind of a little bit quicker because you've done a really good job of explaining them already. First is the risk of over-intoxication because cannabis and alcohol can amplify each other's effects. So you do see an increased risk of cannabis poisoning, alcohol poisoning, or overconsumption of both. We also know that alcohol is a diuretic, meaning that it likes to push a lot of the other fluid out of the body, leaving the person dehydrated. Research does suggest that cannabis may expedite this process and cause the dehydration to be a little worse. We also do see significantly increased risks associated with cannabis impaired driving. So ways to reduce these harms are to consider using one substance or the other. If a person's thinking of smoking or drinking or using cannabis in general or drinking, that they choose one or the other as opposed to mixing. And if they do mix, it's a good idea to drink less alcohol than they usually would and or look for a lower THC content product. And most importantly, they plan a safe ride home. Plan a safe ride home is a harm reduction message you can point out at any age. As opposed to saying, if you drink, don't drive, provide them with options. Give your audience the option, what can you do to get home safely? Lex, in Manitoba, what are some ways people can get home safely in your community?
Well, I live in Winnipeg, so there's lots of options here. Public transit, taxis, Uber, that sort of thing. If you're out in a more rural area, though, then it's certainly something you might have to arrange ahead of time. Like know who you can call for a ride, whether that's your parents, grandparents, friends, your friends' parents. I know some principals that I had would give students their number just so that they would have somebody to call no matter the circumstance. They said they would come and pick you up if you're in a situation. So there's so many different options, but it really depends on the community you're in.
And one thing I often recommend if you're an adult having a conversation with youth, instead of telling them the options, ask them what they know are options. And then you can work on them together, because if they come to those conclusions themselves, they're more likely to remember them. Because when we look at cannabis impaired driving, We understand that it is one of the leading criminal causes of death in Canada. And we also know that Canadians aged 16 to 34 only represent about a third of the population, but they represent 2/3 of cannabis attributable fatalities on the road. Now, last year, among Canadians aged 20 to 24 that report using cannabis, about 21% report driving within 2 hours of smoking or vaping, versus about 11% that report driving within 4 hours of ingesting an edible product. So we know impaired driving does still happen, and unfortunately, it is a very real and significant risk on the roads. So mentioning, explaining, and offering to help someone find a sober driver and to find their way home safely is still and will remain a very important conversation between professionals and youth, professionals and their peers, friends, community members at large. So we talked about what options are available in your community. I'll gloss over that part, but what does cannabis impairment look like? Well, when we talk about cannabis impairment, we have this conversation with youth, and I've asked kids before if you could tell someone's impaired simply by looking at them. There are some physical signs you can look for, and those may include things like bloodshot eyes, red eyes, maybe looking fatigued, maybe they're clearing their throat, they've got a dry mouth, bit of a dry cough, shallow breathing, maybe their heart's racing, so they're having a hard time sitting still, maybe they're a little dizzy, they're reporting poor coordination. And certainly if they've used, or maybe a few hours after they've used, you hear people talk about burnout, they may be fatigued. But the problem is, if you simply look at some of these physical signs, there are many people that could have these physical signs that don't use cannabis at all. Someone doesn't get enough sleep, their eyes may be bloodshot and they may be exhausted. Their coordination may be off too. May not be that they're impaired by cannabis, could just mean they haven't got enough sleep last night. So we also look for some of the behavioral signs as well and try to combine these together, right? So Lex, what are some of the behavioral signs of cannabis impairment?
It could be like delayed reactions to things, like someone tells a joke and then the person waits about 20 seconds before laughing, that sort of thing. They could become really paranoid or anxious, like think everyone is talking about them, think that guy's looking at them funny, that sort of thing. Have an unfocused gaze, just a distorted sense of reality in general, and struggle to focus on the things in front of them, the things that they're trying to focus on, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we have these slides, we talk about what may happen in harm reduction strategies side by side. Now, we know that a third of Canadians that use cannabis do report using tobacco and cannabis together, either rarely, sometimes, or often. This is the second most commonly reported mixed substance with cannabis after alcohol. And the things that need to be considered here are the increased physical damages, particularly to the lungs. Tobacco is a known dangerous substance to the human body. We know the long list of health concerns that tobacco can cause, which can include stroke, heart attack, heart disease, oral cancer, throat cancer, tongue cancer, lung cancer, certainly, emphysema, increased blood pressure, hypertension. And introducing a substance like this on top of cannabis use does increase the risk, certainly, of physical risks. We also know that the introduction of a known addictive substance like nicotine can increase the rate or risk of an individual becoming dependent or developing a dependency to cannabis. So the harm reduction here is quite simple. We are a cannabis neutral program, but we understand the risks of tobacco are extensive. We generally recommend that people simply do not add tobacco to cannabis due to the long list of physical health concerns associated with tobacco. There's other risks to be considered as well. These can include synthetic products. Lex, have you talked about, I'm assuming you talked about products like K2 and Spice in the regions where you work as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. Although like these are still a thing we need to talk about and a thing that people should avoid generally though. But from what I've found talking with youth, very few of them know about these compared to like when I was a younger person. That pre-legalization, I think these were a much bigger thing than post-legalization, but they do hold a lot of risks, including, as you can see, kidney failure, lots of stuff that like you can die from them. And from what people that have used them have told me, they're also just generally unpleasant. So we are a cannabis neutral program. We are not a synthetic cannabis neutral program. So if you choose to use cannabis, don't do these ones. They're unpleasant and they're very dangerous. So avoid them.
Super eloquent. I love it. Now we also have to consider illicit products. We keep talking about the importance of legal products, especially for people that are legal aged. We mentioned that illicit products can be improperly labeled. There is the increased risk of these products being laced or mixed with other substances. This can include other drugs. We did see a report not too long ago, I believe it was in Montreal. I think it was Gabrielle that shared it, talking about how there were some products that they had seen in their community, looking at cannabis products laced with fentanyl. We have seen some reports of these in media. We've also seen reports of cannabis products being laced with other chemicals. We also see the risk of contamination. Some people may handle or prepare cannabis products at home. This doesn't mean that their workstation where they do this is necessarily clean. Illicit market cannabis products may be more likely to have fungus, mold, bacteria, fecal matter on the products themselves, as they're not handled really necessarily in the most clean and sanitary manners. Some people may actually lace cannabis products to change their appearances or change their smell. I've seen reports of lacing cannabis with laundry detergents, chopped up dryer sheets to try to reduce the smell. Some people may even lace it with shards of glass to try to make it sort of glitter a little bit more. And we also see that legal consequences do exist for the possession of illicit cannabis, regardless of age. So if someone does choose to use cannabis, especially if they're of legal age, they should consider purchasing products legally from licensed retailers. Now, we also have the risks to consider: psychological and mental illnesses. Lex, what can we say about these?
Well, there have been studies that showed that especially heavy use of high THC products can contribute to a greater likelihood of suffering from depression or anxiety disorders later in your life. And if you have a family history or some of the genetic markers for schizophrenia, use of cannabis can make it more likely that that person will develop schizophrenia, or possibly make it more likely that it will develop earlier than it would have otherwise. So this is still an area we're learning more about, but generally, if you have that mental history of schizophrenia, it's better to avoid cannabis in general. And in general, it's a better idea to use a lower THC product and wait until you're after 25 to avoid some of those other risks to your mental health.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, we are coming into the last few slides, so we do want to think a little bit about the risks and the harm reduction overall of cannabis. We've talked about different methods, but we want to kind of take a step back before we wrap up and look at cannabis in general. Last poll question for the audience: how many people using cannabis in Canada will experience signs of a cannabis use disorder in their lifetime? Is it 1 in 4, 1 in 6, 1 in 11, or 1 in 20? What are we seeing here from the audience, Lex?
A lot of 1 in 20s and 1 in 6s. I think I saw 1 in 11.
Okay.
Wide range there.
Quite a wide range. A lot of votes for 1 in 6, I see, 1 in 20. The answer here actually depends on the age. So people that use cannabis overall, approximately 1 in 11 will report experiencing signs of a cannabis use disorder in their lifetime. However, if the individual began using cannabis during their teenage years, this rate nearly doubles to 1 in 6, or approximately 16 or 17%. Now, we've seen this in research in Canada and the United States as recently as 2020, and as far back as the early 1990s, that the risk or the rate of cannabis use disorder actually increases the earlier in life a person starts using cannabis products. But we also understand that not all cannabis use is problematic. We are not here to say that cannabis use is or is not a problem. It doesn't really do justice to the topic. But we understand that cannabis use can become problematic. And this would be at the point when it begins to affect a person's life in a negative or harmful way, especially if they choose to continue using. We also understand that cannabis use does exist on a bit of a spectrum, right, Lex? It's not just saying like you either don't use or you use every day. How would you explain that spectrum to someone?
Well, there's lots of different stops on here, and people can exist between these and go back and forth as well. But there's lots of people that don't use cannabis. They might be curious about using it, but they're not using it right now and generally experiencing no negative effects from it. Then there are people that are using it in a low risk way. So these are people that set limits. They never drive after using it. They don't mix with other substances. And they're generally experiencing few or no negative effects at this point. And from there, we get to the risky or problematic use. So these are people that are using it regularly. They're experiencing problems in their life because of their cannabis use, but they continue to use. Maybe at this point, they're not recognizing that these problems are because of their cannabis use, but it's often apparent to the people around them that this is the case. And from there, you get to dependent use, where This is when cannabis use stops to feel like a choice. And it becomes a person's main coping strategy to deal with whenever something negative happens in their life. Cannabis is the way that they deal with that. And just generally here, a lot of the risks that we've been talking about become much, much greater when you're at this dependent use stage. So people that are using daily or almost daily are just much greater risk of all of these problems we've talked about throughout this course of this presentation than people at other stages of this use spectrum. But it's important to remember that just because someone is dependent now doesn't mean that they always will be. In fact, it almost never does. People will generally use cannabis for a period in their life. If they are dependent, it'll be some period in their life. It's not a lifelong thing. People will move back and forth along the spectrum. And often people that are dependent users now will eventually transition to not using at some point in the future.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, it's really never too early or too late to seek support. There are some people that will use cannabis reporting benefits, right? I mean, they're using with a medical advisor, or sort of a healthcare provider speaking with them. They're understanding there's risks to be considered, but they're keeping an eye on their health. They're reporting back and forth, and they're keeping sort of that mindfulness as they use. But again, it's never too early or too late to seek support if you or someone else you know is using cannabis, or if they're thinking about using it, and just to learn more. Right? So someone may want to consider seeking support if they are experiencing conflict with family or friends due to use of cannabis, having trouble focusing on responsibilities, using more over time to feel the same effects as they used to. Perhaps they're developing a tolerance to cannabis, not unlike developing tolerance to caffeine. You know, someone used to drink a cup of coffee and bounce off the walls. Now they drink a pot and they barely move. Cannabis use from an early age, struggling to stop or limit use of cannabis, using daily, feeling isolated or lack of connectedness. Perhaps losing interest in other activities, the use of cannabis while driving or during rigorous or vigorous physical activities. And finally, if someone is using cannabis, particularly as a primary coping strategy to deal with depression or anxiety or stress, and especially if they're losing sight of those other healthy support mechanisms. These can be signs of problematic behavior, and they may be cause for a person to seek support. So if someone is considering using cannabis, we recommend they look for legal non-synthetic products, particularly with lower THC. They avoid the use prior to the age of 25 as the brain is still developing. They designate a sober driver if they plan to travel. They consider healthy alternative coping strategies. The importance of speaking to a healthcare provider, spending time with loved ones, going for a walk, journaling, exercising, doing those things that make them feel better when they're stressed, and keeping that wide array of options in mind. If they do use cannabis, especially if they use more than one substance, they should consider using one at a time as opposed to mixing them in short periods. Seek medical attention if they do feel unwell or experience any new or worsening psychological, mental, or physical health problems after using. And they should certainly avoid the use of cannabis if they're pregnant, have a history of mental illness, or a history of substance use disorders. Now, there are free and confidential service providers available all across Canada. We know these exist on multiple provinces. Here in Ontario, we would see Connex Ontario. National, for younger audiences, we often talk about Kids Health Phone. These service providers are designed to be free. They're anonymous and they're confidential. They provide service by phone, text, online chat, or via social media. Many of them offer access to educational resources, links to other providers, research, fun facts for people to learn more about. Providers often promote health and wellness programs. They may offer support to help someone provide support. You can contact many service providers even if you don't have an issue with substance use, but you know someone who does. It allows you to learn how you can provide support and speak with and help out that individual if perhaps they're experiencing harms due to use. Many providers offer outpatient services, including one-on-one or group counseling. And some providers do also offer residential inpatient treatment for substance use treatment programs and or detox services. So finally, we would like to thank you all for joining us today. We have had a very lovely time speaking with all of you today. You've been a really, really great audience. Love the engagement with the questions that we asked. Lex, is there anything you want to add here before I finalize the recording for today?
No, I think you got it all, Steve.
All right, so I am going to turn off the recording. Thank you all very much. We hope that you enjoy the rest of the day.